So picking up, we're now going to get into some of the more, I guess, denser aspects of the judiciary in terms of how justices are selected, as well as how cases make their way to the Supreme Court. Sorry, I got interrupted there, and I'm not entirely sure where I trailed off, so we'll just dive in. Okay. So again, looking at here the selection of Supreme Court justices, and we've got a political cartoon here. The Obama administration was definitely, with their court picks for the Supreme Court, was really looking to create some diversity. And so with the two picks that he made, they were both minority women who had a more liberal ideological lean to them based on their previous experience. And for the Obama administration, not that they were necessarily looking for an activist judicial philosophy, but the discussion for the picks and sort of the especially protection of civil liberties and civil rights became part of the criticism of the Obama administration and their picks. Okay, this actually goes back into the George W. Bush administration. I'm not going to read through this for you, but you can pause it and read it. It's basically showing how, back really up until into the 20th century, the nominees that a president would pick for the Supreme Court frequently made it through and were put on the bench. But really starting with the Bork era in the 1980s, we are going to see that more and more nominees are being vetted much more heavily. They're going through much more rigorous hearings in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and in some cases they're not getting the votes and they're not getting through. So this is one that goes through one of the picks that George W. Bush had in replacing Sandra Day O'Connor. And then you could also revisit what happened with Antonin Scalia's open seat and President Obama choosing Merrick Garland to fill that seat. And in that case, the Senate Judiciary Committee, which was headed at the time by Chuck Grassley, refusing to even have hearings on that nominee, waiting for the 2016 presidential election to make a decision. Ultimately, then, with President Trump being elected, Merrick Garland was never vetted and never given the Senate approval for taking that seat. Eventually, it went to Neil Gorsuch. Okay, so looking at the judges, again, we're looking at more than just Supreme Court justices. This is all judges on the federal judiciary. Supreme Court justices are known as justices. Appellate and district court judges are judges. It's just a terminology thing. Typically, we will see that many appointed to the bench are lawyers or judges that have come from other courts. So an appellate court judge may have been in the district court level or in state court. Frequently, you will actually see that presidents are now leaning to appointing people that have more of a partisan slant or a known lean, whether it's to the Republican or the Democrats or the conservative to the liberal. Frequently, also, you'll see that they come from middle and upper class backgrounds, which makes sense because that frequently is needed if you want to go on to college and to law school, although not always the rule. Even though we have seen more diversity in the last few decades, overwhelmingly, the judiciary is white and male. We also see that there is no formal qualifications for being a judge or a justice, and so people can be appointed that do not have the background in law, but the expectation today is that they will. So people are looking for competence in judicial appointments. I have a link here, and I encourage you to go. It's not a very long clip. This is one of the appointments that was made a couple of years ago with the Trump administration coming in, and Matthew Peterson became very quickly known for basically having no real experience in court, even though he was a lawyer, and he was being appointed to be a judge. And so he was widely panned. He ended up not getting approval. Then there's also the ideology or the policy preference, and I've got a link here that also goes to a short video, a news story on Jeff Sessions, and this goes back into the 1980s when he was getting appointed for a position in the judiciary, and he actually was also denied because of some of his previous remarks and statements, especially in terms of civil liberties and civil rights. Sometimes it's a reward, someone who has been helpful, and so then they get a nomination to an open seat. And sometimes it's because they would like to get that person's support, so they might make that promise. And then again, diversity can frequently play a role, especially as we've moved into the 21st century. This is a demographic, again, showing you some of the appointments up through the Obama administration. So even though we have seen more and more diversity, overwhelmingly we still see that the white and especially male is still a majority of the appointments. And again, you can start to drill into that and take a look at what do the demographics look for people going to law school too. And there's a lot of things we can drill deeper into. Same thing here with women. Again, more and more and more, and this does not include the Obama administration, but still overwhelmingly white or male. And then looking again, continuing with the selection, the confirmation process in the Senate and the Judiciary Committee will include an investigation into their background. They're going to want to know as many things as they can, both about the public life and, if applicable, the personal associations of the judges and justices that are being appointed. They will go to the American Bar Association and have them and look at their rankings. And so I'm going to pull this up here really quickly. And you can see this is one that was updated at the end of last year, and they are going to go through and rank various people who are being nominated as well qualified all the way down to not qualified. And sorry, interrupted again. So rankings from being qualified to not qualified, and then they might indicate like if there was some discrepancy on the rankings and just kind of how big that discrepancy was. So you can see here Neil Gorsuch was given a well-qualified ranking. Down here to the 7th Circuit Court, Amy Coney Barrett was given a majority well-qualified, but there was a minority that gave her just a qualified ranking. So you can take a closer look at that ABA ranking that exists. So then you will see, again, you can have interest groups lobbying for and against different nominees. Bork is someone who was nominated in the Reagan administration, had a lot of background in terms of rolling back civil rights and being someone that a lot of groups had problems with. And so he ultimately was denied. And today when we see a nominee being denied the position on the Supreme Court, it's referred to as getting borked. Then we also see in the 1980s, especially, the Christian organizations began to develop Justice Sunday. They began to realize that the nominees to the courts and especially to the Supreme Court had a tremendous effect on their agenda. And so they really galvanized their constituents to vote, and especially for president and for the Senate, because then those votes would turn into who gets nominated and approved for these positions. And it really, really made a lot of strong inroads from the 1980s, 90s into the 2000s. And again, as I talked about, we've seen much more intense Senate committee hearings over the nominees. And again, Supreme Court is typically the one that is most often highlighted. It's going to be important because it sets that precedent, their decisions and their rulings for decades, if not centuries to come. But it's also important to note that a president may think that they are nominating someone that shares their philosophy and ideology, but they can be unpredictable. So the Warren appointment by Eisenhower is a really good example of he did not fall in line with Eisenhower's philosophy much of the time. Even now, we can see John Roberts. He was appointed by President George W. Bush, and there have been times where he has leaned a little bit more to the liberal side, albeit he has still very much been considered a conservative justice, but not always going to fall in that line. And I'll end this one. Sorry for all the interruption.